The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, Chapter 1. A Place for Demons. It was feeling night, and the usual crowd had gathered at the Waystone Inn. 5 wasn't much of a crowd, but 5 was as many as the Waystone ever saw these days, times being what they were. Old Cobb was filling his role as storyteller and advice dispensary. The men at the bar sipped their drinks and listened. In the back room, a young innkeeper stood out of sight behind the door, smiling as he listened to the details of a familiar story. When he awoke, Taborlin the Great found himself locked in a high tower. They had taken his sword and stripped him of his tools. Key, coin, and candle were all gone. But that weren't even the worst of it, you see. Cobb paused for effect. 'Cause the lamps on the wall were burning blue. Graham, Jake, and Shep nodded to themselves. The 3 friends had grown up together, listening to Cobb's stories and ignoring his advice. Cobb peered closely at the newer, more attentive member of his small audience, the smith's apprentice. "Do you know what that meant, boy?" Everyone called the smith's apprentice boy, despite the fact that he was a hand taller than everyone there. Small towns being what they were, he would most likely remain boy until his beard filled out or he bloodied someone's nose over the matter. The boy gave a slow nod. "The Chandrain." "That's right," Cobb said approvingly. "The Chandrain. Everybody knows that blue fire is one of their signs. Now he was..." "But how'd they find him?" the boy interrupted. "And why didn't they kill him when they had a chance?" "Hush now. You'll get all the answers before the end," Jake said. "Just let him tell it." "No need for all that, Jake," Graham said. "Boy's just curious. Drink your drink." "I drank me drink already," Jake grumbled. "I need another, but the innkeep's still skinning rats in the back room." He raised his voice and knocked his empty mug hollowly on the top of the mahogany bar. "Hoy! We're thirsty men in here!" The innkeeper appeared with 5 bowls of stew and 2 warm, round loaves of bread. He pulled more beer for Jake, Shep, and Old Cobb, moving with the air of bustling efficiency. The story was set aside while the men tended to their dinners. Old Cobb tucked away his bowl of stew with the predatory efficiency of a lifetime bachelor. The others were still blowing steam off their bowls when he finished the last of his loaf and returned to his story. Now, Taborlin needed to escape, but when he looked around, he saw his cell and had no door, no windows. All around him was nothing but smooth, hard stone. And it was a cell no man had ever escaped. But Taborlin knew the names of all things, and so all things were his to command. He said to the stone, "Break!" and the stone broke. The wall tore like a piece of paper, and through that hole, Taborlin could see the sky and breathe the sweet spring air. He stepped to the edge, looked down, and without a second thought, he stepped out into the open air. The boy's eyes went wide. "He didn't!" Cobb nodded seriously. So Taborlin fell, but he did not despair, for he knew the name of the wind, and so the wind obeyed him. He spoke to the wind, and it cradled and caressed him. It bore to him, the grounded, as gently as a puff of thistledown, and he set him on his feet softly as a mother's kiss. And when he got to the ground and felt his side where they had stabbed him, he saw that it weren't hardly a scratch. Now, maybe it was just a piece of luck, Cobb tapped on the side of his nose knowingly, or maybe it had something to do with the amulet he was wearing under his shirt. "What amulet?" the boy asked eagerly through the mouthful of stew. Old Cobb leaned back on his stool, glad for the chance to elaborate. A few days earlier, Taborlin had met a tinker on the road, and even though Taberlin didn't have much to eat, he shared his dinner with the old man. A right sensible thing to do, Graham said quietly to the boy. Everyone knows a tinker pays for kindness twice. No, Jake grumbled. Get it right. A tinker's advice pays kindness twice. The innkeeper spoke up for the first time that night. Actually, you're missing more than half, he said, standing in the doorway behind the bar. A tinker's debt is always paid, once for any simple trade, twice for freely given aid, 3 for any insult made. The men at the bar seemed almost surprised to see Cote standing there. They'd been coming to the Waystone every felling night for months, and Cote had never interjected anything of his own before. Not that you could expect anything else, really. He'd only been in town for a year or so. He was still a stranger, and the Smith's prentice had lived here since he was 11, and he was still referred to as the Ranish boy. As if Ranish were some foreign country and not a town less than 30 miles away. Just something I heard once, Cote said to fill the silence, obviously embarrassed. Old Cobb nodded before he cleared his throat and launched back into the story. Now, this amulet was worn with a whole bucket of gold royals, but on account of Taberlin's kindness, the tinker sold it to him for nothing but an iron penny, a copper penny, and a silver penny. It was black as a winter's night and cold as ice to touch, but so long as it was round his neck, Taberlin would be safe from the harm of evil things, demons and such. I'd give a good piece for such a thing these days, Shep said darkly. He had drunk most and talked least over the course of the evening. Everyone knew that something bad had happened out on his farm last Sendling night, but since they were good friends, they knew better than to press him for the details. At least, not this early in the evening, not as sober as they were. Aye, who wouldn't, old Cobb said judiciously, taking a long drink. I didn't know that Chandrain were demons, the boy said. I'd heard. They ain't demons, Jake said firmly. They were the first 6 people to refuse Telu's choice of the path, but he cursed them to wander the corners. Are you telling this story, Jacob Walker? Cobb said sharply. 'Cause if you are, I'll just let you get on with it. The 2 men glared at each other for a long moment. Eventually, Jake looked away, muttering something that could conceivably have been an apology. Cobb turned back to the boy. That's the mystery of the Chandrain. He explained. Where do they come from? Where do they go after they're done with their bloody deeds? Are they men who sold their souls? Demons? Spirits? No one knows. Cobb shot Jake a profoundly disdainful look, though every half-wit claims he knows. The story fell further into bickering at this point about the nature of the Chandrain, the signs that showed their presence to the wary, and whether the amulet would protect Taberlin from the bandits or the mad dogs, or falling off a horse. Things were getting heated when the front door banged open. Jake looked over. It's about time you got in, Carter. Tell this dang fool the difference between a demon and a dog. Everyone... Jake stopped mid-sentence and rushed to the door. God's body, what happened to you? Carter stepped into the light, his face pale and smeared with blood. He clutched an old saddle blanket to his chest. It was an odd, awkward shape, as if it were wrapped around a tangle of kindling sticks. His friends jumped off their stools and hurried over at the sight of him. I'm fine, he said, as he made his slow way to the common room. His eyes were wild around the edges, like a skittish horse. I'm fine. I'm fine. He dropped the bundled blanket onto the nearest table, where it knocked hard against the wood as if it were full of stones. His clothes were crisscrossed with long, straight cuts. His gray shirt hung in loose tatters except where it was stuck to his body, stained with dark, sullen red. Graham tried to ease him into the chair. Mother of God, sit down, Carter. What happened to you? Sit down. Carter shook his head stubbornly. I told you I'm fine. I'm not hurt that bad. How many were there? Graham said. 1, Carter said. But it's not what you think. God dang it, I told you, Carter, old Cobb burst out with a sort of frightened anger only relatives and close friends can muster. I told you for months now, you can't go out alone, not even as far as Baden. It ain't safe. Jake laid a hand on the old man's arm, quieting him. Just take a sit, Graham said, still trying to steer Carter into a chair. Let's just get that shirt off of you and get you cleaned up. Carter shook his head. I'm fine. I got cut up a little, but the blood's mostly Nellie's. It jumped on her. It killed her about 2 miles outside the town, past the old stone bridge. A moment of serious silence followed the news. The smith's apprentice laid a sympathetic hand on Carter's shoulder. Dang, that's hard. She was gentle as a lamb, too. Never tried to bite or kick when you brought her in for shoes. Best horse in town. Dang. He trailed off. Dang, I don't know what to say. He looked around helplessly. Cobb finally managed to free himself from Jake. I told you, he repeated, shaking a finger in Carter's direction. There's folks out lately that would kill you for a pair of pennies, let alone a horse and a cart. What are you going to do now? Pull it yourself? There was a moment of uncomfortable quiet. Jake and Cobb glared at each other while the rest seemed at a loss for words, unsure of how to comfort their friend. The innkeeper moved carefully through the silence, arms full. He stepped nimbly around Shep and began to arrange some items on a nearby table. A bowl of hot water, shears, some clean linen, a few glass bottles, needle, and gut. This would never have happened if he'd listened to me in the first place, old Cobb muttered, and Jake tried to quiet him, but Cobb brushed the younger man aside. I'm just telling the truth. It's a dang shame about Nellie, but he better listen now or he'll end up dead. You don't get lucky twice with those sort of men. Carter's mouth made a thin line. He reached out and pulled the edge of the bloody blanket. Whatever was inside flipped over once and snagged on the cloth. Carter tugged harder, and there was a clatter in the bag of flat river stones upended onto the tabletop. It was a spider as large as a wagon wheel, black as slate. The smith's apprentice jumped backward and hit the table, knocking it over, almost falling onto the ground himself. Cobb's face went slack. Graham, Shep, and Jake made wordless, startled sounds and moved away, raising their hands to their faces. And Carter took a step backward that was almost like a nervous twitch. Silence filled the room like a cold sweat. The innkeeper frowned. They can't have made this far west yet, he said softly. If not for the silence, it was unlikely anyone would have heard him, but they did, and their eyes pulled away from the thing on the table to stare mutedly at the red-haired man. Jake found his voice first. You know what this is? The innkeeper's eyes were distant. Scrael, he said distractedly. Thought the mountains. Scrael? Jake broke in. Blackened body of God, Cote. You've seen these things before? What? The red-haired innkeeper looked up sharply, as if suddenly remembering where he was. Oh, no, of course not. Seeing that he was the only one within arm's length of the dark thing, he took a measured step away. Just something I heard. They stared at him. Do you remember the trader that came through about 2 span ago? They all nodded. Bastard tried to charge me 10 pennies for a half-pound of salt, Cobb said reflexively, repeating the complaint for perhaps the 100th time. I wish I'd bought some, Jake mumbled. Graham nodded, silent agreement. He was a filthy shim, Cobb spat, seeming to find comfort in the familiar words. I might pay 2 in a tight time, but 10 is robbery. Not if there are more of those on the road, Shep said darkly. All eyes went back to the thing on the table. He told me that he heard of them over the Melcombe, Cote said quickly, watching everybody's faces as they studied the thing on the table. I thought that he was just trying to drive up his prices. What did he say? Carter asked. The innkeeper looked thoughtful for a moment and then shrugged. I didn't get the whole story. He was only in town for a couple of hours. I don't like spiders, the smith's apprentice said. He remained on the other side of the table, some 15 feet away. Cover it up. It's not a spider, Jake said. It's got no eyes. It's got no mouth either, Carter pointed out. How does it eat? What does it eat? Shep said darkly. The innkeeper continued to eye the thing curiously. He leaned closer, stretching out a hand. Everyone edged farther away from the table. Careful, Carter said. Its feet are sharp like knives. More like razors, Cote said. His long fingers brushed the thing's black, featureless body. It's smooth and hard, like pottery. Don't go messing with it, the smith's apprentice said. Moving carefully, the innkeeper took one of the long, smooth legs and tried to break it with both hands, like a stick. Not pottery, he amended. He set it against the edge of the table and leaned his weight against it, and it broke with a sharp crack. More like stone. He looked up at Carter. How did it get all these cracks? He pointed at the thin fractures that crazed the smooth black surface of the body. Nellie fell on it, Carter said, and it jumped out of the tree and started to climb all over her, cutting her up with its feet. It moved so fast, I didn't even know what was going on. And Carter finally sank into the chair at Graham's urging. She's got it tangled in her harness and fell on it and broke some of its legs. And then it came after me and got on me, crawling all over. He crossed his arms in front of his body, his bloody chest, and shuddered. I managed to get it off of me and stomped it hard as I could. And then it got on me again, and he trailed off, his face ashen. The innkeeper nodded to himself as he continued to prod the thing. There's no blood, no organs. It's just gray inside. He poked it with a finger, like a mushroom. Great Telu, just leave it alone, the smith's apprentice begged. Sometimes spiders twitch after you kill them. Listen to yourselves, Cobb said scathingly. Spiders don't get big as pigs. You know what this is. He looked around, making eye contact with each of them. It's a demon. They looked at the broken thing. Oh, come on now, Jake said, disagreeing mostly out of habit. It's not like... He made an inarticulate gesture. It can't just... Everyone knew what he was thinking. Certainly, there were demons in the world, but they were like Telu's angels. They were like heroes and kings. They belonged in stories. They belonged out there. Tamerlane the Great called up fire and lightning to destroy demons. Telu broke them with his hands and sent them howling into the nameless void. Your childhood friend didn't stomp one to death on the road to bait in Brit. It was just ridiculous. Cote ran his hand through his red hair and then broke the silence. There's one way to tell for sure, he said, reaching into his pocket. Iron or fire. He brought out a bulging leather purse. In the name of God, Graham pointed out. Demons fear 3 things: cold iron, clean fire, and the holy name of God. The innkeeper's mouth pressed itself to the straight line that was not quite a frown. Of course, he said as he emptied his purse onto the table and then fingered through it. The jumbled coins, heavy silver talents and thin silver bits, copper jots, broken halfpennies, and iron drabs. Does anyone have a shim? Just use a drab, Jake said. That's good iron. I don't want a good iron, the innkeeper said. A drab has too much carbon in it. It's almost steel. He's right, the smith's apprentice said. Except it's not carbon. You use coke to make it steel, coke and lime. The innkeeper nodded deferentially to the boy. You'd know best, young master. It's your business after all. His long fingers finally found a shim in the pile of coins. He held it up. Here we are. What will it do? Jake asked. Iron kills demons. Cobb's voice was uncertain, but this one's already dead. It might not do anything. One way to find out. The innkeeper met each of their eyes briefly, as if measuring them, and then he turned purposefully back to the table, and they edged farther away. Cote pressed the iron shim to the black side of the creature, and there was a short, sharp crackling sound, like a pine log snapping in a hot fire. Everyone startled, and then relaxed when the black thing remained motionless. Cobb and the others exchanged shaky smiles, like boys spooked by a ghost story. Their smiles went sour as the room filled with the sweet, arid smell of rotting flowers and burning hair. The innkeeper pressed the shim onto the table with a sharp click. Well, he said, brushing his hands against his apron. I guess that settles that. What do we do now?